My name is Adrielle. I'm 44 years old, and the day my family started fighting over my things while I was still alive, I realized how little they valued me. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't whispered behind closed doors. It was right there, in my own house, echoing down the hallway while I lay in bed recovering from surgery. My daughters, Serena and Lila, were in the living room, their voices sharp with tension. At first, I thought it was another one of their usual arguments over clothes, or who used the car, or who got more attention. But then I heard the words that made my blood run cold. "I get the ring, Lila. Mom promised it to me ages ago," Serena snapped. "That's not fair," Lila shot back. "You always think you're the favorite." "That ring should be mine. I'm the one who deserves it." I lay frozen, the sheets clutched in my hands. They were talking about my mother's diamond ring. A ring I had worn every day since she passed away. A ring that carried not just monetary value, but memories, love, history. And they were fighting over it as if I were already gone. Then came a voice I wasn't expecting, my younger sister Camilla. She was visiting me while I recovered, though I suspected now it wasn't out of kindness. "Girls," she said slyly, "if you're smart, you'll push your mom to put things in writing. Don't wait until it's too late, or you'll be left with nothing." I felt sick. My own sister, fueling the fire, whispering poison into their ears. As they bickered, I felt invisible. Not one of them asked how I was doing. Not one of them checked if I was resting comfortably. I could have been lying in that bed, dying, and all they cared about was who would walk away with my possessions. I tried to tell myself it was just stress talking, that they didn't really mean it. But then I heard Serena say the words that shattered me. "She won't need it much longer anyway." The air left my lungs. I pressed a hand to my chest, as if steadying my heart could make the words hurt less. But they sank deep, like daggers. My daughters, my flesh and blood, were waiting for me to die so they could divide my things. Tears blurred my vision. I thought back to the countless nights I'd worked double shifts to provide for them. The years I went without new clothes, nice meals, even proper rest just so they could have what they needed. I had poured every ounce of myself into raising them. And this was what I meant to them now? Not a mother, not a woman who had sacrificed everything, just a collection of things to inherit. When I finally gathered the strength to walk into the living room, they all fell silent. 3 pairs of guilty eyes turned to me. "What?" I asked softly, my voice trembling. "Are you doing?" Lila looked down at her feet. Serena crossed her arms, defiant. Camilla smirked like a snake who had been caught mid-slither. "We were just talking, Mom," Serena said, brushing it off. "It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" My voice rose sharper now. "You're fighting over my things while I'm still alive. Do you hear yourselves?" Claire's cheeks flushed, but she muttered, "It's not like you're going to live forever." The room went cold. Even Camilla shifted uncomfortably at that. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to demand how they could be so cruel, but instead, I turned away. Because in that moment, I understood something chilling. They didn't see me as Adrielle, their mother, their sister, a woman who had bled and wept and fought for her family. They saw me as a vault, a treasure chest, a body attached to things. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but their words still echoed in my head. "She won't need it much longer anyway." I thought about my mother's ring, about the furniture I'd saved years to buy, about the artwork that held pieces of my story. Every item they craved carried memories, sacrifices, pieces of my soul. But to them, those things were just prizes to fight over. A deep sadness washed over me, but beneath it, a spark of something else began to burn. Anger. If they thought of me as nothing more than things, then maybe I needed to remind them that those things were mine. That love couldn't be bought with a diamond, that sacrifice wasn't measured in furniture or handbags. And so, I made a quiet promise to myself. If they wanted to fight over me while I was alive, then, when I was gone, they would inherit nothing. That night, as I lay awake, I decided if they saw me only as things, then one day, they would inherit nothing. It wasn't love they wanted from me, it was my things. I could no longer deny it. In the days that followed, I started noticing how often Serena, Lila, and even Camilla brought up my possessions, each in their own way, like predators circling a meal they thought was theirs by right. Serena was fixated on the ring. My mother's diamond ring wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of history. A symbol of strength that had passed from mother to daughter for 3 generations. My mother had worn it through hardship, through joy, through the bitter end of her own battles. When she slipped it onto my finger, she said, "This is more than a ring, Adrielle. It's a reminder that women in our family endure." But Serena didn't see history. She saw a diamond. She would linger near me when I wore it, her eyes glinting, her voice sugary sweet as she'd say, "You know, Mom, that ring would look amazing on me." Sometimes she even tried it on when she thought I wasn't looking, twirling her hand in the mirror like she already owned it. Lila had her eyes set on other things, the furniture, the paintings, the handbags I'd collected over the years. She once ran her hand over the oak dining table and said casually, "When I move into my own place, this would be perfect for me." "You don't really need it anymore, do you, Mom?" I laughed it off at the time, but it wasn't funny. She wasn't asking. She was staking a claim. Then there was Camilla. My sister had never been subtle about her envy. Growing up, she always resented me for being the lucky one, as she put it. I married first, had children first, bought a house first. She, on the other hand, had drifted from one failed relationship to another, scraping by in a small apartment. Now, seeing me with possessions she could never afford, Camilla dripped venom disguised as advice. "You know, Adrielle," she told me one afternoon, sipping coffee at my kitchen table, "it's irresponsible not to finalize your will. You don't want your daughters fighting after you're gone, do you?" I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to tell her they were already fighting. And I knew, deep down, she wasn't concerned about harmony, she was concerned about whether her name would appear anywhere in that document. One night, as I passed the living room, I overheard Serena and Lila arguing again. Serena hissed, "Mom already promised me the ring." Lila shot back, "You're delusional. Just because you're older doesn't mean you get everything first. She loves me more." And then, like a serpent sliding into the conversation, Camilla added, "Don't fight with each other. Just make sure you're smart. Push your mother to choose now. If you wait, you'll regret it." That was when I realized this wasn't just about greed, it was about a sickness growing in my family, one that turned love into transactions and affection into entitlement. Every item they lusted after had meaning to me. The oak table wasn't just furniture, it was the first real piece I bought after years of living with secondhand scraps. The painting above the mantel wasn't just art, it was from a local artist I'd supported when I could barely afford to. The handbags they coveted weren't just fashion, they were little trophies I bought for myself after years of sacrifice, reminders that I was worth something too. But to them, these were just things. Things to be claimed, sold, shown off. It was crushing, realizing that the blood, sweat, and tears I'd poured into providing for my family had reduced me to a collection of possessions in their eyes. I tried talking to them about it once. I sat them down and said, "Do you understand how much these things cost me? Not in money, but in effort, in sacrifice. They aren't just objects, they're pieces of my life." Lila rolled her eyes. "Mom, you're being dramatic. We're just curious. It's not like we want you to die." But Serena, sharper than her sister, muttered under her breath, "Not yet, anyway." I froze. She laughed quickly, pretending it was a joke, but the damage was done. My heart clenched. Even if she meant it lightly, the fact that she could say it at all told me everything I needed to know. Camilla, of course, only made things worse. She began planting seeds of doubt, whispering to my daughters that I favored one over the other. "I've always thought Adrielle loved Serena more," she told Lila. "Why else would she keep promising her that ring?" Then, to Serena, she said the opposite. "Your mother always spoils Lila. Don't let her push you out." I watched it unfold like a twisted play. My daughters grew colder with each other, more competitive, more resentful. And all the while, Camilla hovered in the background, smiling like she was orchestrating the whole thing. It broke my heart. I had always dreamed of leaving them with more than I ever had: a home, heirlooms, stability. But now I saw the ugly truth. Leaving them those things would only destroy them further. That night, lying awake, I whispered to myself, they don't deserve it, not like this. And for the first time, I let the thought take root. Maybe my daughters and my sister would never change. Maybe greed had already eaten too deeply into their hearts. And if that was the case, then why should they benefit from my life's sacrifices? Why should they inherit treasures they never respected, possessions they only saw as prizes? A new idea began to burn inside me, faint but fierce. Maybe my things weren't meant for them at all. Maybe they were meant for someone else, for people who would value them, for causes that would matter, for strangers who understood sacrifice. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. And the more their greedy words replayed in my mind, the more determined I became. That was when I decided to keep my secrets close, and my revenge even closer. Every item they fought over was bought with blood, sweat, and tears. That's what they never seemed to understand. To Serena, Lila, and even Camilla, my things were shiny prizes, markers of wealth. But to me, each one was a story, a memory, a wound, and a victory. They weren't objects, they were chapters of my life written in glass, wood, leather, and gold. I remembered those early years after my divorce, when my daughters were still little. I had nothing. Their father had walked away, leaving me with 2 toddlers, a mountain of bills, and no plan. I worked 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. There were nights when dinner for me was a slice of bread so the girls could eat. The oak dining table they wanted so badly, that table was the first real piece of furniture I ever bought brand new. I'd saved for nearly 2 years, setting aside $5 here, $10 there, until finally I could walk into the store and say, I'll take it. I cried the first night we ate dinner at it, because it felt like proof that we were moving forward, that I was giving my daughters more than hand-me-downs and borrowed scraps. The handbags Lila admired? Each one marked a milestone. A promotion at work, a debt finally paid off, a birthday where, instead of buying toys for the girls or groceries for the week, I allowed myself one small indulgence. They weren't just leather, they were little trophies of survival. And that diamond ring? It was priceless, not because of its carats, but because of the hands that had worn it before mine. My mother had endured more than I ever did: poverty, abuse, the grinding reality of being invisible in a world that demanded so much of her. When she gave me that ring, she told me, "You'll understand someday. This is not just a piece of jewelry. This is our strength, passed down." And now, hearing my daughters bicker over it, as though it was just a shiny stone, felt like they were spitting on her memory as well as mine. I remembered walking to work in the freezing rain because I couldn't afford gas. I remembered patching the soles of my shoes with tape so I could stretch them one more month. I remembered selling my grandmother's locket, something I had sworn I'd keep forever, just to buy diapers. None of those sacrifices were visible to them. They only saw the end result: a home that looked stable, furniture that looked polished, clothes that looked respectable. They didn't see the nights I cried in silence, the bills I juggled, the meals I skipped. I thought about the art piece above the mantel, the one Lila said she wanted for her apartment. I bought it from a struggling local artist on a day when I had just enough extra to splurge. She had tears in her eyes when I handed her the money. She told me it was the first time someone believed in her work. That painting wasn't just art. It was a moment of shared survival between 2 women trying to hold on to dignity. And yet, my daughters didn't care. They didn't want to know the story behind the brushstrokes. They just wanted the frame. Even Camilla's envy had roots in misunderstanding. She thought I'd been lucky, that things had just come easily to me. She never saw the nights I scrubbed floors until my knees ached. She never saw the mornings I dropped Serena and Lila at daycare, with pennies in my pocket, praying I'd make enough tips that day to cover the fee. It's funny how people look at possessions and assume they know the story. To them, a ring is a ring, a table is a table, a handbag is just leather. To me, they were monuments. Evidence that I had clawed my way through years of desperation and managed to build something worth holding on to. And yet, the people I had built it all for, the very daughters I nearly destroyed myself to raise, didn't see it. Didn't care. Didn't value the sweat behind the shine. That was the wound that cut deepest. I used to picture leaving my daughters my most cherished possessions, imagining how touched they'd feel holding them, knowing what I'd gone through to give them that inheritance. I thought they'd say, "Mom worked so hard for this, and now it's ours to honor her." But I was wrong. What I heard instead was, "I deserve this. I want this. I'll fight you for it." It made me realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. My sacrifices had shielded them so much from struggle that they couldn't see value the way I did. To them, survival wasn't a memory, it was a story they half listened to when I reminisced. They had never gone hungry, never worn shoes with tape on the soles, never wondered if the lights would be cut off. They had grown up safe because I bled to keep them safe. And now, that safety had bred entitlement. I stared at my things one night, walking slowly through my house. The table, the paintings, the ring. I touched each one, remembering what it had cost me. And I whispered to myself, "You are not just objects. You are my battles. My victories. You are worth more than the greed of people who can't see you." It was then that the anger began to harden into resolve. My daughters thought these things would be their inheritance. My sister thought she could manipulate her way into a share. None of them realized that the real inheritance I had hoped to give was the story behind the things, the lessons, the sacrifices, the strength. If they couldn't respect that, they didn't deserve the things themselves. That thought settled over me like a heavy truth. It wasn't enough to scold them or remind them of my sacrifices. They had shown me who they were, and I had to show them who I could be in return. From that moment, I stopped thinking of my possessions as gifts to leave behind. I began to see them as tools of justice, weapons of revenge, instruments to ensure that when I was gone, the only thing my family would inherit was the lesson they had refused to learn while I was alive. And so, I stopped seeing my possessions as gifts for them and started seeing them as weapons of justice. If my daughter's greed hurt me, my sister Camilla's betrayal nearly destroyed me. She had always been a shadow in my life, hovering close enough to compare herself to me but far enough to resent everything I achieved. Growing up, she was the reckless one, the wild one, the one who lived on impulse while I shouldered responsibility. When we were girls, our mother used to scold me for carrying too much and Camilla for carrying nothing at all. And yet somehow, all these years later, I was the one being punished for doing everything right. Camilla had a way of poisoning things without seeming to. She never shouted, never openly demanded, never made herself look greedy. No, her skill was subtler, she whispered. She planted seeds. She smiled while dripping venom into the ears of anyone who would listen. And now, she had found the perfect audience in my daughters. I first noticed it when Serena started repeating Camilla's phrases. "Mom, you really should make a will soon," she told me one afternoon, her tone rehearsed. "Aunt Camilla says it's irresponsible not to." That word irresponsible was Camilla's, not Serena's. I could almost hear her saying it in her sly, measured way. Then Lila started parroting her as, "Well, Aunt Camilla says you promised Serena the ring. But that's not fair. You should split things evenly." My stomach turned. Not only was Camilla fueling their obsession, she was twisting the story, rewriting my words, turning my daughters against me. One evening, I overheard a conversation that shattered me. I had gone to bed early, but their voices drifted through the thin walls. "Don't wait for your mom to decide," Camilla urged them. "She favors one of you more. She always has. If you're not careful, you'll be left with scraps." "That's not true," Lila whispered, uncertainty in her tone. "Of course it's true," Camilla said smoothly. "Look at how she treats Serena. She gets everything first. You need to stand up for yourself, Lila. Don't let her push you aside." My fists clenched under the covers. Camilla had turned my daughter's normal sibling rivalry into a battle over my corpse while I was still breathing. It wasn't just whispers either. Camilla had started hinting to neighbors and distant relatives that my health was failing fast. I learned this when a friend called me, concerned, saying she'd heard from Camilla that Adrielle doesn't have long. I was furious. My surgery had been serious, yes, but I was recovering. I was alive. And yet my own sister was walking around town speaking about me like I was halfway in the grave, all so she could accelerate the inheritance she believed she deserved. The cruelest part? She wasn't even subtle with me. She'd sit at my table, sip from my mug and say, "You know, you can't take it with you. Better to decide now, before it's too late." I would stare at her, biting my tongue, fighting the urge to throw her out of my house, but something stopped me each time. Because I realized, if I showed my anger, she'd win. If I revealed my plans, she'd fight harder. So I smiled. I nodded. I pretended to listen. And all the while, inside, I was writing the face-sieve Reese of Steam and Startly and Harry Wan Baloo's prices. The script for her downfall. It was Camilla's interference that finally solidified my resolve. My daughters were greedy, yes, but they were still young. They had been shaped by the poison Camilla fed them, by the entitlement I had unknowingly allowed to grow. But Camilla was different. She was old enough to know better. She had lived long enough to make her own choices. She wasn't a child repeating mistakes, she was a viper, deliberately coiling herself around my daughters, whispering until they believed her hiss over my voice. And for that, I decided, she would pay. The betrayal cut deepest because Camilla had once been my closest confidant. After my divorce, she was the one I called in the middle of the night when I didn't know how to go on. She came over sometimes, sat on my floor, and helped fold laundry while I cried. I thought she understood my struggle. I thought she admired my strength. But now I saw the truth. She resented me even then. Every load of laundry folded in my home reminded her of her own lack of stability. Every milestone I reached became another mark against her. My pain had been her comfort, but my survival had been her jealousy. Now, sitting at my table, she disguised her resentment as concern. She'd say, "You don't want your girls at each other's throats after you're gone." But what she really meant was, "Hurry up and hand over the pieces so I can take my share." And my daughters, my own flesh and blood, were letting her lead them like lambs to slaughter. I began writing everything down, every comment she made, every time Serena or Lila parroted her words, every time she twisted my story. I knew one day I'd need to explain myself, and when that day came, I wanted proof not just of their greed, but of Camilla's poison. At night, I would lie awake imagining her face at the reading of my will. The shock, the fury, the realization that all her plotting had been for nothing. It gave me a dark satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Camilla thought she was clever. She thought she was steering the ship. But what she didn't realize was that I had already set a new course, one that would leave her stranded with nothing. If my daughter's greed wounded me, Camilla's betrayal forged me. It hardened me into a woman who no longer felt guilt about revenge. If my own sister could turn my children against me, then why should I feel any shame about turning the tables? If Camilla wanted my things so badly, she'd live to regret it. The day I found my daughters sneaking through my jewelry box while I was asleep, something in me broke. I had been exhausted that afternoon, my body still weak from recovery. I drifted off on the couch, only to wake to the faint sound of drawers sliding open upstairs. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But then I heard hushed voices, Serena's sharp whisper, Lila's defensive hiss. My heart sank as I pushed myself up and climbed the stairs, slowly, quietly, afraid of what I already knew I'd find. When I reached my bedroom door, I froze. There they were, my daughters, their heads bent over my jewelry box like thieves in the night. Serena held my mother's diamond ring between her fingers, the light from the window catching on the stone. Lila's hand darted toward the pearl necklace I had worn to my wedding. "I told you, the ring is mine," Serena snapped in a harsh whisper. Lila shoved her back lightly. "You're not entitled to everything just because you're older. Mom should have left this to me." My breath caught. Left this to me. As if I were already gone. I pushed the door fully open, and it slammed against the wall. They both jumped, guilt flashing across their faces. "What?" I said, my voice low and shaking. Are you doing? For a second, no one moved. Serena quickly dropped the ring back into the box, her cheeks flushed. Lila crossed her arms, defiant even in shame. Mom, Serena began, her voice unsteady. We were just looking. Looking? My voice cracked. Through my things? While I'm alive? While I'm right downstairs? Lila rolled her eyes, though I saw fear flicker beneath her bravado. It's not like you're using them right now. And we need to know who gets what, before it becomes a bigger fight. Her words pierced me deeper than she realized. Before it becomes a bigger fight, as if this wasn't already war. You're my daughters, I said, tears stinging my eyes. You're supposed to care about me, not what I leave behind. Serena sighed, trying to smooth things over. Mom, don't be dramatic. We're just being practical. You should want us to be prepared. Prepared. That word felt like poison. Prepared for my death. While I still breathed. Prepared to divide my life into piles of what they thought they deserved. Camilla's voice echoed in my head. Make sure your mom decides now. Don't wait. I realized then that she had pushed them to this moment, whispering in their ears until they crossed a line I thought they'd never cross. I closed the jewelry box with trembling hands and pulled it toward me. Get out! I whispered. They hesitated, exchanging guilty glances. Now! I snapped, louder than I intended. My voice cracked through the room, and finally they shuffled past me, avoiding my eyes. When the door shut behind them, I sank onto the bed and clutched the jewelry box to my chest. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold it. These pieces weren't just gold and stones, they were fragments of my life, my mother's life, my grandmother's. And my daughters had reduced them to prizes to fight over. I sat there for a long time, staring at the closed box. Every sacrifice I had made, every tear I had shed, every late night at work, every skipped meal, it had all been so they could grow up safe, loved, cared for. And yet, here they were, sneaking into my bedroom, treating me like I was already in the ground. Something hardened inside me that day. Love had made me blind, sacrifice had made me soft, but betrayal made me sharp. I locked the jewelry box away that night, hiding it in a place I knew they'd never find. Then I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. His voice was warm, steady, a lifeline. Adrielle, what can I do for you? I need to change my will, I said. My voice didn't shake. It was clear, strong, final. He paused. All right, do you know what changes you want to make? I looked at the box in my lap, at the glimmer of the diamond peeking out from beneath the lid. I thought of Serena's greedy hands, Lila's defiant stare, Camilla's poisonous whispers. Yes, I said firmly. I want them to get nothing, not my daughters, not my sister, nothing. There was silence on the line, then a quiet, Are you sure? I closed my eyes. My heart ached, but my resolve was unshakable. I'm sure. When I hung up the phone, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control. They thought they could strip me down to objects, divide me into piles before I was even gone. But I would not let them. They would learn, one day, that love is not measured in diamonds, or furniture, or handbags. They would learn that greed has consequences. And when that day came, the shock on their faces would be my final justice. That was the night I called my lawyer and began rewriting my will. They thought they were entitled to my things, but they had no idea I was already rewriting their future. The morning after I caught Serena and Lila in my jewelry box, I drove to my lawyer's office. My body still ached from recovery, but my spirit was on fire. I wasn't going to wait another day, not another hour, to put my plan into motion. Mr. Donnelly had been my lawyer for over a decade. He had helped me with my divorce, with buying my house, with protecting the little stability I'd managed to build after years of chaos. When I sat across from him that morning, his eyebrows lifted at the determination in my eyes. Adrielle, he said gently, you look like a woman with a heavy decision. I am, I admitted, folding my hands tightly on the desk. I need to change my will. He nodded, pulling out a notepad. All right, tell me what you'd like to change. I took a deep breath. I want my daughters and my sister to get nothing. He froze, pen in midair. Nothing? Nothing, I repeated, my voice steady. Not a ring, not a chair, not a dollar. They've already fought over my things as if I were dead. They don't deserve to inherit anything from me. Mr. Donnelly studied me carefully. That's a bold decision. Do you want to talk through why? I told him everything about the arguments, the sneaking into my room, the way Camilla had fueled the fire. I confessed the heartbreak of realizing that my daughters saw me as possessions instead of a person. As I spoke, tears blurred my vision, but my voice never wavered. When I finished, he leaned back and sighed. Adrielle, I've seen a lot of families tear themselves apart over inheritance, but I've also seen clients make rash decisions in anger. Are you absolutely sure? I met his gaze firmly. Yes. This isn't anger. This is clarity. He nodded slowly. Then let's make it airtight. You want your estate to go where? That was the question that shifted everything. Where should it go? I thought of the women's shelter I once leaned on when I was first divorced, the place that had given me food and safety when I had nowhere else to turn. I thought of the scholarship fund that helped me finish my education when money was tight. I thought of charities that supported mothers like me, women who gave and gave until nothing was left, only to be forgotten by the very people they sacrificed for. To them, I whispered. To the shelters, to scholarships, to anyone who actually needs it, I want every cent, every object, every piece of value to go to people who will understand what it's worth. Mr. Donnelly nodded and began drafting. We'll ensure it's legally binding, impossible to contest. But I'll warn you, your family won't take this lightly. I don't expect them to, I said bitterly. But they left me no choice. We spent hours that day going through every detail. The house, the furniture, the jewelry, the savings. Each item that Serena or Lila had once tried to claim was redirected into the hands of strangers who would never know me but who would honor what those things meant far more than my family ever could. And then, at the end, Mr. Donnelly asked, "Do you want to leave them anything at all? A letter, perhaps? Something to explain?" At first, I shook my head. My instinct was to leave them with silence, but as I sat there, I realized silence wouldn't teach them anything. They'd twist it, blame each other, blame Camilla, blame the world. They needed to hear it from me. Yes, I said finally. Letters, one for Serena, one for Lila, one for Camilla. I want them to understand why they got nothing. I want them to know exactly how their greed killed their inheritance. Mr. Donnelly scribbled a note. I'll attach those letters to the will when the time comes. That way, they'll hear your words along with the legal reading. That night, I went home and sat at my desk, staring at blank pages. The house was quiet, but my mind roared. What could I possibly write that would pierce through the entitlement, the greed, the poison Camilla had poured into them? I began with Serena. My firstborn. The one I thought would carry on my strength. You wanted my ring more than you wanted my love. You fought your sister for it while I was alive. That ring was never meant to be a prize. It was meant to remind you of resilience. But you never saw it that way. So now, it goes to someone who will. Then Lila. My baby. The one I thought would inherit my gentleness. You measured spaces for furniture before I was even gone. You saw my sacrifices as things to decorate your apartment with, instead of stories of survival. So now, those pieces will furnish homes for people who truly need them. Finally, Camilla. Writing hers was the hardest, and yet the easiest. My sister, you poisoned my daughters against me. You whispered lies into their ears. You wanted my things because you couldn't build your own, but my legacy will never be yours to claim. You will leave this world with the same envy you entered it with. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling, my eyes swollen from tears. But I felt lighter. I sealed the letters in envelopes and locked them away, ready for the day they would be delivered. From then on, I carried my secret like armor. My daughters smiled at me, pretended kindness, tried to win favor, but I knew the truth. Every fake hug, every sugary word only strengthened my resolve. They thought they were manipulating me, but really, I was watching them dig their own graves in my heart. And every night, I smiled to myself, knowing that when the time came, their hands would be empty. If they wanted to fight over me, they would end up fighting over nothing. From then on, I played a role a mother pretending to trust daughters I no longer did. It was a mask I wore every single day. Smiles over dinner, laughter at the right moments, soft nods when they told me about their plans. To them, I looked the same. But underneath, I was steel. Every word they spoke, every glance they shared, every mention of what happens when, only sharpened my resolve. Serena would hover near me while I cooked, her eyes flicking to my hands. "You should really let me wear the ring sometime, Mom," she said one evening, her tone playful but edged with hunger. "You know it's going to be mine anyway." I forced a smile, stirred the pot, and replied, "Maybe, someday." Inside, I thought, someday, never. Lila was subtler, but her greed surfaced in little ways. When I invited her to help me reorganize the living room, she casually ran her hands along the back of the sofa. "This would look amazing in my apartment," she mused. Then she added with a grin, "Of course, when I finally get it, I'll redecorate the whole place." I laughed with her, as if we were sharing a harmless joke, but inside, my heart burned. And Camilla never stopped. She called nearly every day, asking about my health, always phrasing it as concern. "How are you feeling, Adrielle? Any new doctor visits?" "You know, it's important to have your affairs in order," I answered politely, never letting her see the satisfaction I carried like a secret flame. If only she knew the will was already sealed, every signature in place, her name nowhere on the pages. But I kept quiet. I pretended. Because the longer they thought I was pliable, the deeper their true colors showed. Family dinners became performances. Serena and Lila bickered subtly over who poured my water, who helped me to my seat, who asked more about my day. To an outsider, it might have looked like love. To me, it was strategy. They weren't caring for me, they were auditioning for their inheritance. I sat there, smiling, thanking them, hiding the bitterness in my chest. All the while I wanted to scream, "Stop pretending. I see through you. I know what you're after." But I didn't, because silence was my weapon now. There were moments that nearly broke me. Like when Lila leaned her head on my shoulder one evening and whispered, "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom." For a split second, I wanted to believe it was genuine. That behind the greed, there was still love. But then she added, "When I get the house, I'll keep this spot as it is, so I'll always remember you." I froze. The house wasn't even cold, and she was already decorating it in her mind. Serena wasn't much better. She once sat at the table polishing her nails and said, "I'm glad you're finally recovering, Mom. You need to last long enough to make sure everything's divided properly." I laughed out loud, masking the sting. "Of course, darling," I said. "I'll make sure of it." They didn't notice the double meaning. The hardest part was keeping the mask on around Camilla. She had an instinct for weakness, a way of sniffing out cracks in my armor. She'd lean close during visits, her perfume sharp and cloying, and murmur, "You know, Adrielle, I can help make sure the girls don't fight when you're gone. If you just tell me what's in the will, I'll make sure it's fair." I wanted to laugh in her face. Fair? To her, fair meant her hands around my things. But I kept my voice soft, my eyes gentle. "I appreciate that, Camilla. I'll think about it." She smiled, smug, convinced she was winning. And I smiled back, knowing she'd already lost. Pretending wasn't easy. At night, I lay in bed, exhausted not from illness but from the performance of love. I wanted to rage, to demand apologies, to beg them to see me, really see me, as more than the things I owned. But I knew that battle was over. They'd made their choice. And I had made mine. So I played my part. The loving mother, the forgiving sister, the woman who acted like nothing had changed. But inside, I was no longer theirs. My heart had sealed itself away, safe behind the knowledge that when the curtain finally fell, the performance would end with them empty-handed. Sometimes, I even caught myself enjoying it. The sweetness of their words, the fake kindness in their gestures, it was almost amusing, knowing that all their effort was wasted. Every "I love you, Mom," spoken through gritted teeth, every polite smile at the dinner table, it was like watching actors give their all in a play, unaware that the script had already been rewritten. And I was the playwright. The guilt came in waves. I'd see Serena laughing with her friends, or Lila curled up on the couch watching a movie, and I'd remember the babies I once held, the children who used to cling to me with real love. But then I'd hear them argue about my possessions again, sometimes even when they thought I wasn't listening, and the guilt hardened back into resolve. They had chosen greed over love. They had betrayed the very sacrifices that built their lives. And Camilla had poisoned what little was left. So I smiled. I played along. I let them think they were winning me back. All the while, I whispered to myself at night, every fake smile I give them is another nail in the coffin of their inheritance. Every fake smile I gave them was another nail in the coffin of their inheritance. The more they thought they were winning me over, the bolder their greed became. It started with small hints, sly comments that grew sharper with every passing week. Serena would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, twirling my mother's diamond ring on her finger when she thought I wasn't paying attention. "You know, Mom," she said one evening, her tone light but her eyes hard, "you really should let me keep this safe now. What if you lose it? You're always misplacing things." I set down the spoon I was holding and looked at her carefully. "It's not lost, Serena. It's exactly where it should be." She laughed, but her laugh didn't reach her eyes. Lila wasn't any better. One afternoon, she walked through the living room with a measuring tape, stretching it across the sofa and jotting numbers in her notebook. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked up casually. "Oh, just checking if this would fit in my apartment. It's not like you'll need it forever, right?" Her words sliced me open. Not like I'll need it forever. They had stopped pretending. The mask of care and love was slipping, replaced with naked greed. Camilla of course, only fanned the flames. She started showing up with estate brochures, laying them on my table as though she were helping me plan. "It's important to make sure your belongings don't get wasted," she said one afternoon, sipping tea. "I know how much your girls want your things. Wouldn't it be better to avoid conflict by deciding now?" I smiled politely and tucked the papers away, all the while laughing inside. If only she knew that the decision had already been made, written, sealed, and notarized. But the more I stayed silent, the more reckless they became. One night, I overheard Serena and Lila arguing again, their voices loud enough to rattle the walls. "I'm the oldest," Serena snapped. "The ring and the house should be mine. You can take the smaller things." "Are you kidding me?" Lila shot back. "You've always acted entitled. The house is big enough for me to actually use. You'd just sell it." Camilla's voice slithered into the fight. "Girls, don't fight. There's enough for both of you. If your mother does the right thing." The right thing? As if the right thing was letting them carve me up before I was even cold in the ground. I sat in my room, tears stinging my eyes, listening to the three of them speak about me like I was already gone. And something inside me shifted. The sadness I'd carried for weeks hardened into something sharper. A cold satisfaction. Let them fight. Let them measure, argue, scheme. The more they revealed their greed, the sweeter their disappointment would be when they realized the truth. They had been fighting over air. Their boldness spilled into daily life. Serena once asked me directly, "Mom, do you plan to give Lila anything at all? Or is it all coming to me?" I raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think either of you deserve anything?" She blinked, caught off guard, then laughed nervously. "Of course we do. We're your daughters." "Yes," I said softly, "you are." I left it at that, savoring the confusion on her face. Lila, not to be outdone, cornered me a few days later. "Mom, you've always said family comes first, so why not make it official? Write it down." I smiled and touched her cheek. "Don't worry, sweetheart, it's already official." She grinned, thinking she had won. If only she knew that those words meant the opposite of what she believed. Even Camilla grew careless. She called me one evening, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I just want to make sure I'm not forgotten, Adrielle. After all I've done for you, I deserve something too." I almost laughed out loud. All she had done for me? Poison my daughters, whisper rumors, spread her envy like a disease? I bit back the laugh and said sweetly, "Don't worry, Camilla, you won't be forgotten." And she wouldn't be. Her letter was already written, sealed, waiting to shatter her illusions. What struck me most was how quickly love seemed to vanish from their words. When I was younger, I imagined my daughters comforting me in my old age, laughing with me, cherishing the time we had left together. Instead, they circled me like vultures, more interested in what I would leave behind than who I was while I was still here. The more they revealed themselves, the more I withdrew. I smiled, I played my role, but I stopped hoping. Hope was dangerous. Hope meant believing they could still change, still see me as more than my possessions. But their boldness proved the truth. They were gone already, consumed by greed. One evening, as I sat alone at the dining table, I looked around the house. The oak table, the painting, the ring, each piece seemed to glow in the dim light, whispering its history back to me. I touched the surface of the table and thought, "They think they own you already, but you're mine. You'll always be mine. And when I'm gone, you'll go to someone who deserves you." That thought brought me peace. For the first time, in weeks, I felt calm. Because I knew the ending to this story, even if they didn't. Let them get bolder. Let them fight harder. The higher they built their expectations, the harder the fall would be. What they didn't know was that their future was already empty. I realized then that death wasn't the punishment they needed to feel loss while I was still alive. Up until that moment, I had been content with my secret. My rewritten will, my carefully worded letters, my plan to leave them with nothing after I was gone. But the more their greed festered, the more I felt suffocated in my own home. They were circling me like wolves, waiting for me to collapse, and I knew, deep in my bones, that letting them believe they had won until my final breath wasn't enough. No, they needed to understand what loss felt like now, while they could still look me in the eyes. It started with something small. Serena had left one of her handbags on the counter, bragging earlier that it was a limited edition she had splurged on. That night, I quietly donated it to a local women's shelter. When she came storming into the kitchen the next morning, demanding, "Mom, did you move my bag?" I simply shrugged. "Maybe you misplaced it," I said, sipping my tea. "Things have a way of disappearing." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Lila's test came a week later. She had been eyeing the set of crystal glasses I kept in the cabinet, saying more than once, "These would look perfect in my place." The next time she visited, they were gone, already donated to a charity auction. "Where are the glasses?" she asked sharply, yanking open cabinets. I smiled. "Oh, I decided I didn't need them anymore. Someone else will make better use of them." The silence that followed was heavy. Lila didn't say it out loud, but I could see the panic in her eyes. For the first time, she realized that my things weren't guaranteed to land in her lap. Camilla noticed too. She came over one afternoon and gasped when she saw the empty spot where a painting once hung. "Adrielle," she said, her tone dripping with false concern. "What happened to your artwork?" I tilted my head and smiled sweetly. "I gave it away. It wasn't meant to sit in this house forever." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish. She didn't press, but I could see her mind racing. If I was giving things away now, what did that mean for later? It thrilled me, watching their greed turn into anxiety. For years, they had assumed my possessions were theirs by birthright. Now, suddenly, the ground beneath them was shifting, and I wasn't done. Every few weeks, I chose something else to part with quietly, deliberately: jewelry, furniture, clothes. Each item went to someone who needed it, someone who would value it far more than my family ever had. And each time my daughters or sister noticed something missing, I gave the same calm response. I decided to let it go. The anger on their faces was a kind of justice I hadn't expected. Serena once slammed her fist on the table and shouted, "You can't just give away our inheritance." "Our inheritance?" I repeated, my voice cold. "It's mine. Until I take my last breath, it's mine. And I'll do with it what I choose." She stormed off, muttering, but I knew my words had sunk deep. The more I gave away, the freer I felt. My house began to look lighter, emptier, but in a way that made me proud. Each empty space was a reminder that I was no longer chained by their expectations. Each missing item was proof that I still had control over my life, my things, my legacy. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming myself. But the real moment of clarity came one night when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I realized that my daughters and sister had taught me something valuable without meaning to. Possessions only have power when they are hoarded. The moment you let them go, their grip loosens. I had spent years clinging to these things, believing they were symbols of my survival. And in a way, they were. But survival wasn't in the objects, it was in me. It had always been in me. That realization was liberating. For so long, I had imagined my daughters sitting at the reading of my will, their faces falling when they realized they got nothing. But now I knew the real revenge was happening already. With every donation, every empty cabinet, every missing treasure, I was teaching them the lesson they refused to learn. Nothing in life is guaranteed. The next morning, I donated the most significant piece yet, my wedding china. It had been boxed up for years, rarely used, but Serena had once claimed it loudly as hers. I drove it to a shelter kitchen, imagining the women there eating from plates that once sat untouched in my home. It felt right. When Serena discovered the empty cupboard, she screamed at me. "How could you? That was supposed to be mine." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "It was never yours, and it never will be." She didn't speak to me for 3 days after that, but I didn't care. The silence was almost peaceful. Each act of giving away tightened my resolve. They had reduced me to objects, and now I was stripping those objects from their reach. I wasn't punishing them by dying with nothing left. I was punishing them by living with nothing they could claim. And strangely, with every piece I gave away, I felt more alive. And soon, the final betrayal would hit them harder than they ever imagined. The night Serena screamed at me for not promising her the ring, I knew I was done. It started innocently enough, or at least it seemed to. We were sitting at the dining table, a quiet evening meal of roasted chicken and vegetables. The kind of dinner that once would have been filled with laughter and conversation. But now, every bite carried tension. My daughters weren't looking at me, they were looking at what surrounded me. The ring on my finger, the chair I sat in, the table beneath us. Halfway through dinner, Serena set her fork down with a loud clink. "Mom," she said, her voice sharp, "enough is enough. Are you going to keep dodging the question? Or are you finally going to tell us who gets the ring?" The room froze. Lila glanced up from her plate, her eyes narrowing. I calmly dabbed my mouth with my napkin. "Serena, I've told you before, it's not yours to claim. Not yet. And not ever while I'm alive." Her face twisted. "That's not fair, you said once. I never promised it to anyone." I cut her off firmly. Lila smirked at her sister. "See, she never promised you. Maybe it's mine." Serena slammed her hand on the table, rattling the glasses. "You don't deserve it, Lila. You don't even care about Mom's things, you just want to sell them." "And you don't?" Lila shot back, her voice rising. "You'd pawn that ring the first chance you got." They were shouting across the table, both of them red with fury, when Camilla, who had come by for dinner, chimed in with her poison. Girls," she said smoothly, though her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Arguing won't solve anything. Adrielle, you really should settle this. You're only making it worse by dragging it out." Her words struck me like a slap. Dragging it out? I wasn't dragging anything. I was still alive. But to them, my existence was the delay. Something inside me snapped. I stood abruptly, the chair screeching across the floor. My hands trembled, but my voice came out sharp as steel. Enough! Do you hear yourselves? Fighting over me as if I'm already dead? They fell silent for a moment, startled by my outburst. But Serena quickly recovered, her eyes blazing. You're being selfish, Mom. You're not thinking about us. Selfish? I repeated, stunned. After everything I've given you? After the years I went without so you could have more? After I worked myself to the bone to give you this life? And you dare call me selfish? Lila crossed her arms, her voice dripping with defiance. We're just being realistic. You can't take it with you. Camilla leaned back in her chair, smirking like a cat who had cornered her prey. They're right, Adrielle. You should stop being so dramatic. You're not immortal. The heat rose in my chest until it felt like fire. For weeks I had played the pretend mother, smiling through their greed, swallowing my anger. But no more. Not tonight. I slammed my fist on the table, making the plates jump. You want the truth? Fine. You will get nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing! Their faces drained of color. Serena's mouth dropped open. What are you talking about? I stared at each of them, my voice shaking with rage and heartbreak. I've already changed my will. Every last thing gone, donated, given to people who deserve it more than you ever will. When I'm gone, you'll sit with empty hands. And you'll remember this night. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Serena exploded. She shot to her feet, her chair crashing backward. You can't do that. You can't just take everything from us. I can, I said coldly. And I already have. Lila's eyes filled with tears, though anger burned in her voice. You'd rather give our inheritance to strangers than to your own daughters? I met her gaze, my heart breaking even as I spoke. I'd rather give it to people who understand sacrifice, who won't spit on it with greed. Camilla's face twisted with fury. You've lost your mind, Adrielle. Do you know how cruel this is? After everything I've done for you, I laughed bitterly. Everything you've done for me, you poisoned my daughters against me, you turned them into vultures. And you think I owe you? Her face darkened. You'll regret this. No, I whispered, my voice steady now. You will. The air in the room was thick with rage. Serena stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. Lila followed, her eyes wet with betrayal. Camilla lingered for a moment, her lips curling into a sneer. You've made a mistake, she hissed. When you're gone, they'll hate you for this. I looked her dead in the eyes. Better they hate me for my choices than remember me as the fool who gave them everything. She left without another word, the echo of her heels sharp against the floor. When the house finally fell silent, I collapsed into my chair, my body shaking. Tears poured down my face. Not from regret, but from the weight of the moment. The mask had shattered. The truth was out. There was no going back now. And strangely, I felt free. For months, I had carried the burden of secrecy, smiling through their lies, pretending not to see their greed. But tonight, I had spoken the truth aloud. They knew now. They understood what was coming. And their fury, their disbelief, their betrayal, it was proof that my choice had been right. I had given them love their whole lives. I had sacrificed more than they would ever know. But love without respect is wasted. And respect was something they had killed long ago. Now all that was left was justice. I had given them love their whole lives. Now I would give them nothing. I knew my time was running short, but my plan was already set in stone. The decision had weight to it heavier than any ring or painting. It sat in my chest like a rock when I woke each morning and a quiet hum under my skin when I slept. I wasn't dying that week or that month. But the surgery and the whispers and Camilla's gossip had made one thing clear. Life is fragile, and plans made in a hurry are easily undone. So I made mine carefully, with the kind of slow, deliberate hands that had stitched my family back together more times than anyone ever thanked me for. After the fight at dinner, I couldn't pretend anymore. I stopped smiling as much, stopped letting their petty claims slide like water off a coat. I called Mr. Donnelly and told him to prepare for the final draft. He asked the careful questions, funeral wishes, guardianships if needed, not relevant, but he checked, hospital directives. I answered each one without hesitation. The will, I told him, would leave everything to charities and scholarships. The letters were to be delivered with the reading of the will, the legal safeguards were to be ironclad, no loopholes, no contests. Writing the letters was harder than I expected. Drafting legal documents is a lawyer's business. Pouring my heart into words was mine. I set up the old wooden desk by the window where light fell best and opened a fresh notebook. The house was quiet. They were out probably plotting the next move, and for the first time in months, I had space to think without being interrupted by greedy whispers. I started with Serena because she had always been the first to the front lines, loud, sure, demanding. My pen hovered above the paper and then finally moved. My Serena, I wrote. You were my first fierce love. I carried you across days when the world felt like too much. I taught you to be bold. But boldness without humility breaks things. You fought for a ring thinking it would prove you worthy. But worth is not wrapped in diamonds. I hope the silence I leave you teaches you more than any jewel could. Be kinder to the parts of you that don't roar. The words surprised me, gentle where I had expected bitterness. It wasn't forgiveness for them. It was an attempt to reach them in a way my shouting had never managed. Lila's letter was different. She had always worn her impulsive heart on her sleeve, soft and reckless in equal measure. Dear Lila, I wrote. You loved the beauty of things and wanted the world to look like a pretty picture. I understand that hunger, but buying comfort with other people's sacrifice never fills the holes inside. I give these things away not to spite you, but to save you from becoming someone who values shine over substance. Learn to build your own small victories, then keep them close, not for show, but for proof that you can. Camilla's envelope felt like a rock to lift. The pen trembled in my fingers more with hers than with either daughter's. We had been sisters. We had shared laundry days and bottle-fed babies and midnight phone calls. I had once trusted her with secrets. Trust felt foolish now. Camilla, I wrote plainly, you called yourself my sister, but you poisoned my house. I will not gaslight you into silence with a bequest that would reward your envy. I cannot give what you did not earn: integrity, love, honor. You will leave this with the memories you made. I pray they teach you, but I do not expect miracles. I folded each letter, slid it into its envelope, and sealed them. The act felt ceremonial, like pressing a stamp on a goodbye that had been brewing for years. I dated them, signed them with my full name, Adrielle Marlowe, and tucked them into a file with a calm hand. I left instructions with Mr. Donnelly about the reading. I wanted it to be plain and unembellished. No eulogy puffed with favors, no sympathetic hand from Camilla. Let them hear my words first, he said. He promised to read them in my voice as best he could, to attach the letters to the will so there would be no mistaking intent. There were practical things to do too. I arranged for certain pieces to be delivered now, while I could watch them go to hands that would appreciate them. I drove a few items to the shelter where I had once stood hungry and ashamed. The woman at the desk recognized me and hugged my elbow in a way that made me cry. To a scholarship fund I'd once benefited from, I donated money with a note, in honor of all the women who kept their families together in the dark. Those deliveries felt good in a way vengeance never could. They grounded me in the meaning behind the plan. I also set a few small gestures aside for myself: an extra weekend in a cheap seaside motel that I booked months ago, a letter to myself to read on bad days, a box of tea tins that smelled like my mother's kitchen. It felt important to keep pieces of joy for the living. I wasn't crafting only a punishment, I was reclaiming comfort. When I handed the final instructions to Mr. Donnelly, he hesitated, then offered a softness I hadn't expected. You'll be here to see some of this through, he said gently, unaware of how final his words felt. I smiled at him. I might be, I answered, and I might not. But if I am gone, at least I will be sure my things are in honest hands. That night, I packed a small bag not for a trip, but because the act of closing a zipper felt decisive. Inside went a few books, my favorite sweater, the loose change from the jar I kept on the dresser. I walked through the house, touching familiar things, the back of the sofa, the worn edge of the table, the spot on the wall where a picture hung, and I thanked them quietly, as if they were friends who had stood by me. The hardest goodbye wasn't to objects. It was to the version of myself that had believed love would always be enough. I had loved too long without boundaries. I had given until there was nothing left. This was the new line I drew: love but protect, give but guard. It felt cruel and necessary all at once. Before I closed the desk, I lit a candle and sat for a long time. The flame made small dances on the paper, the same paper that held my farewell. I thought of my mother and how she had pressed that ring into my hand. I thought of the late nights, the cold shoes, the sandwiches cut into thirds so the girls could have more. I thought of laughter, scraped knees, the warmth of two small bodies curled against me during storms. Those memories softened the edges of my plan. I didn't want to die angry. I wanted to die clear. And so, when I sealed the last envelope and watched Mr. Donnelly take it into his custody, I felt not triumph but a deep, odd peace. I had written my final goodbye not as a curtain call but as a lesson given, delivered, and impossible to ignore. I had chosen what mattered more than appeasing greedy hands. And in doing so, I had finally chosen me. When they opened my will, they would finally understand the cost of their greed. I wasn't there when they gathered for the reading of my will, but I can imagine their faces. In truth, I had already pictured it 100 times in my mind. The stiff chairs in Mr. Donnelly's office, the air heavy with anticipation. Serena tapping her manicured nails against the armrest, certain she was about to walk away with my diamond ring and the house. Lila sitting forward, wide-eyed, trying to mask her impatience. And Camilla, the snake herself, leaning back with her smug little smile, convinced she'd charmed her way into a share of my life's work. What they didn't know was that I had already been there, in spirit, in every line of that document and every letter sealed with my hand. Mr. Donnelly told me later how it unfolded. He said they arrived restless, exchanging sharp words even before they were called inside. Camilla kept muttering about how long overdue this was, while Serena hissed at Lila not to snatch what wasn't hers. Lila shot back that Serena always assumed she was the favorite. It was the same old fight, dragging into the lawyer's waiting room like a storm cloud. When they finally sat down, Donnelly began with the usual formalities: the date, my name, the signatures. Serena was barely listening. She was already eyeing the desk as if he'd pull the ring out like a magician revealing his final trick. But then, the words came. To my daughters, Serena and Lila, and to my sister, Camilla, I leave you nothing. The silence that followed was, as Mr. Donnelly described, heavy enough to choke on. Serena blinked, her mouth falling open. Nothing? She repeated, as though the word itself was a foreign language. Lila let out a strangled laugh, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. No, read it again. That's not right. And Camilla, her smile evaporated. She leaned forward, her voice low and dangerous. That's impossible. You're misreading it. But Mr. Donnelly didn't flinch. He had expected this. He read the next part slowly, his voice steady. All of my possessions, savings, jewelry, furniture, and property are to be donated to charities and institutions that provide aid for women, children, and families in need. It is my final wish that the fruits of my sacrifice serve those who will honor them, rather than those who only covet them. Serena slammed her hand on the armrest. This is a joke. She wouldn't do this to us. We're her children. Mr. Donnelly calmly slid the sealed envelopes across the desk, my letters. She left you these, he said. They snatched them up like lifelines. Serena ripped hers open with shaking hands. Lila hesitated before tearing into hers. Camilla snatched hers and muttered, She always did love theatrics. I know what they read. My words had been etched onto those pages with tears and steel. Serena's face must have gone red as she read. You wanted my ring more than you wanted my love. You fought your sister for it while I was alive. That ring was never meant to be a prize. It was meant to remind you of resilience, but you never saw it that way. So now, it goes to someone who will. Lila, her voice probably trembling, read, "You saw my sacrifices as things to decorate your apartment with, instead of stories of survival. So now, those pieces will furnish homes for people who truly need them. And Camilla? Well, hers was the sharpest blade. You poisoned my daughters against me. You whispered lies into their ears. You wanted my things because you couldn't. Build your own. But my legacy will never be yours to claim." Mr. Donnelly told me that Camilla ripped her letter into pieces right there in his office, the paper shaking in her fists. "She's insane," she spat. "This isn't fair. We'll contest it." But Donnelly simply shook his head. "The will is airtight. You can try, but you'll lose." Adrielle made sure of that. Lila began to cry then, real tears spilling down her cheeks. But they weren't tears of grief for me, they were tears for herself. For the life she thought she was inheriting, suddenly ripped away. Serena, furious, shoved her chair back and pointed at Donnelly. "You helped her do this. You brainwashed her." He just looked at her with calm eyes. "No." She was very clear. "She wanted you to hear her words. And now you have." The three of them sat there, stunned, their world collapsing around them. For months they had measured, plotted, argued over things they believed were guaranteed. And in one reading, it was all gone. I wasn't there to see their faces, but I can imagine them. Serena, red with fury, her pride shattered. Lila, sobbing, her fantasies of inheritance slipping through her fingers. Camilla, pale with rage, her envy consuming her from the inside out. And me? I smiled, even in memory. Because for once, the fighting didn't matter. The possessions they had treated as trophies were no longer theirs to claw at. The ring, the table, the paintings, all of it was already on its way to shelters, charities, strangers who would see their worth. My daughters and my sister were left with nothing but the truth, and the truth was heavier than any inheritance they could have carried. For once, their fighting didn't matter because there was nothing left to fight for. What they couldn't destroy were my words, the letters I left behind. They could throw tantrums, rip paper, curse my name, and accuse the lawyer of lies. But nothing could erase the ink I had pressed into. Those pages. Words don't vanish when you burn them. They linger, etched into the conscience, repeating themselves in quiet hours. And I knew, deep down, that's what would haunt them more than losing the ring, the house, or the china. Serena was the first to lash out. "Mr. Donnelly told me," she left his office in a rage, clutching my letter like a piece of evidence in a trial. Later, she ripped it into strips, tossed it in the fireplace, and watched the flames curl around it. She thought fire would erase my voice, but words don't die in smoke. When she looked at her bare finger, unadorned by the ring she once felt entitled to, she would still hear me. "You wanted my ring more than you wanted my love." No amount of ash could silence that truth. Lila, on the other hand, wept. She sat in her car outside the lawyer's office, clutching my letter to her chest like a wound she couldn't close. She read it again and again, her tears staining the paper until the ink smudged. She couldn't throw it away. She couldn't bring herself to burn it. She folded it, unfolded it, stared at the lines she didn't want to believe. "You saw my sacrifices as things to decorate your apartment with, instead of stories of survival." Those words clung to her. Every time she walked into her half-decorated apartment, every time she admired someone else's home, she would remember. I had seen her hunger for things, not meaning. My letter became a mirror she couldn't escape, reflecting back all the ways she had failed me. And Camilla, my sister, the one who had smiled in my face while whispering poison into my daughter's ears. She shredded her letter in the office itself, bits of paper fluttering to the floor like confetti from a cruel celebration. She was jealous of me, she snarled. She always was. But even Camilla, with all her venom, couldn't escape the sting of my words. "You wanted my things because you couldn't build your own, but my legacy will never be yours to claim." She could pretend I was bitter, she could paint me as dramatic, but the truth had landed. She had spent her life chasing what wasn't hers, and now she was left empty-handed, forced to face the envy she carried like a second skin. What none of them understood was that my words were never meant to be cruel for cruelty's sake. They were my last attempt to cut through the fog of greed, to shake them awake in ways I never could while alive. I can picture Serena lying awake at night, staring at her bare dresser, wondering why she thought a diamond would fill the hole in her chest. I can see Lila folding my letter back into its envelope, hiding it in a drawer, only to pull it out again when guilt gnawed at her. And I know Camilla, no matter how many times she cursed me, couldn't stop replaying the truth in her mind. She had been left with nothing because she gave nothing but envy in return. The letters were the inheritance they didn't want but couldn't escape. And that was the point. Objects can be stolen, sold, or broken. Words? They stay. They echo. They slip into your dreams and greet you in the quiet of morning. That was my final gift, my final revenge, a legacy they could neither claim nor forget. Meanwhile, my things were already doing good in the world. The ring, donated to a fundraiser, helped raise money for women rebuilding their lives after abuse. The oak table went to a family shelter, where mothers and children sat around it for their first stable meals together. My paintings hung in community spaces, inspiring strangers I'd never meet. Every time my daughters or Camilla heard whispers of these donations in town, they would feel the sting again. They would know the ring wasn't adorning Serena's hand, but helping a stranger survive. The table wasn't in Lila's apartment, but in a shelter filled with laughter not born of greed. The art wasn't on Camilla's wall, but bringing joy to people who had nothing. And over, my letters would remind them why. I like to think that, maybe someday, the words would do more than wound. Maybe Serena would finally realize that love was never a competition for objects. Maybe Lila would see that beauty without sacrifice was hollow. Maybe Camilla would, well, maybe she never would. Some people can't be saved by words, not even when they burn themselves into the skin. But even if they never changed, I had given them what they deserved. Truth. Unvarnished, undeniable, unerasable truth. Because in the end, inheritance is not what fills your hands. It's what lingers in your heart. And my words? They linger still. They would remember my words long after the ashes of my possessions were gone. I used to think my legacy would be measured in things. The ring, the table, the house. The quiet little trophies I collected through years of sacrifice. But in the end, my true legacy wasn't what I left behind, it was what I refused to leave in greedy hands. When I picture the strangers who now hold pieces of my life, I feel a peace I never thought possible. A young woman wearing my ring, not as a prize but as a symbol of survival. A family eating dinner around my oak table, their laughter echoing where once there had been silence. Children pointing at the paintings that once hung in my living room, imagining stories in the brushstrokes. My life didn't end with Serena's entitlement, Lila's selfishness, or Camilla's poison. My life reached beyond them, stretching into places where love and gratitude could take root. That was my true inheritance. And maybe that's what I had to learn all along. That blood doesn't always understand sacrifice. That family can betray you faster than strangers will. That love, when it's taken for granted, withers in greedy hands. But sacrifice given to the right hearts? It multiplies. I no longer wonder if my daughters hate me for what I did. Hate, after all, is still a kind of attention. They may curse my name, clutch my letters with shaking hands, or try to rewrite the story of who I was. But none of that matters now. Because they cannot undo what I've already done. They cannot claw back what I've already given away. I had spent my life building for them, hoping they'd honor it. Instead, they fought, they measured, they claimed. So I rewrote the ending. Not just for me, for them too. Because sometimes the only way to teach a lesson is to let someone lose what they took for granted. When people in town whispered about my choices, I imagine it shocked them. She left her daughters nothing, they might say. She left her sister with empty hands? But those who really knew me, who had watched me work late nights, stretch pennies, and fight tooth and nail for every scrap of stability, they understood. They nodded quietly and said, she knew what she was doing. Because I wasn't just punishing greed, I was rewarding need. I know Serena probably stares at her bare finger even now, wondering how she lost something she never truly had. I know Lila likely walks through her apartment, eyes settling on empty corners where she once imagined my furniture, only to feel the sting of absence. And Camilla, well, she will carry the bitterness of envy until her final breath. That was always her burden to bear. But me? I carry peace. For once in my life, I chose myself. Not their demands. Not their expectations. Not their entitlement. I chose to honor the woman who had survived hunger, exhaustion, and heartbreak. I chose to honor the sacrifices that built me. I chose to ensure those sacrifices lived on in places where they would be respected. That is my rewritten legacy. It doesn't sit behind glass in my daughter's homes. It isn't whispered about in Camilla's jealous circles. It breathes in shelters, in schools, in community halls. It shines in the hands of strangers who see value not in the object itself but in what it represents: perseverance, survival, dignity. And that, more than anything, is how I want to be remembered. I know people will ask, did I love my daughters? The answer will always be yes. Fiercely, painfully, completely. But love without respect is wasted. I gave them every chance to see me as more than a vault of possessions. They chose greed. And so, I chose justice. I hope someday, when their anger fades and their pride loosens its grip, they'll read my words again and understand. I hope they'll realize I wasn't taking from them, I was giving them a lesson worth more than any inheritance. The lesson that love cannot be bought, that entitlement cannot replace sacrifice, that nothing in this world is owed. If they never understand, then so be it. My life doesn't hinge on their recognition. My story doesn't end with their bitterness. Because in the end, I wasn't defined by the things they wanted to steal from me. I was defined by what I chose to do with them. I rewrote the ending. I rewrote my legacy. And when the dust settles, when the letters are folded and the anger fades into silence, what will remain is this: I was never theirs to claim. My life, my sacrifices, my things, they were always mine. And in the end, I gave them to the world, not to the greedy hands that tried to own me.